This is BBC One. Now Fiona Bruce with the BBC News at 10 o'clock.
Still no majority for Theresa May as the Conservatives and the DUP haven't yet reached a deal. She needs the 10 seats won by Arlene Foster's DUP in Northern Ireland, but what do they want in return?
Issues around Brexit, obviously around counter-terrorism, and then doing what's right for Northern Ireland in respect of economic matters.
In the Commons, Labour's Jeremy Corbyn didn't miss the chance to crack some jokes at Mrs May's expense.
I'm sure we all look forward to welcoming the Queen's speech just as soon as the coalition of chaos has been negotiated.
Theresa May holds her first meeting with a European leader since the election. Brexit is top of the agenda.
I think there is a unity of purpose among people in the United Kingdom. It's a unity of purpose, having voted to leave the EU, that their government gets on with that and makes a success of it.
Mrs May insists that the Brexit negotiations will begin next week as planned, despite the political uncertainty. Also tonight, inflation jumps to a 4-year high, squeezing family incomes and outstripping wages. Our children are starving in a country with one of the largest oil reserves in the world. President Trump's Attorney General denies allegations he colluded with Russia in the election campaign.
I have never met with or had any conversation with any Russians or any foreign officials concerning any type of interference with any campaign.
And Harry Kane scores a double in Paris, but was it enough to beat France?
Coming up in Sports Day later in the hour on BBC News, it's now 2 defeats in 4 matches for the Lions on tour and just over a week and a half to the first test against the All Blacks.
Good evening. Talks today between Theresa May and Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party about enabling the Prime Minister to get a working majority in the Commons haven't yet resulted in a deal. Both sides, though, said the talks had gone well and an agreement is expected tomorrow. The DUP leader, Arlene Foster, has outlined her priorities, among them Brexit and counter-terrorism. The former Conservative Prime Minister, John Major, has added his voice to concerns about the implications of a deal with the DUP and its possible repercussions on the peace process in Northern Ireland. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, reports.
They're all here. With new MPs, Parliament returning to its business. The Commons Speaker elected, well, dragged by tradition to his grand chair again. But a government in charge? Not quite yet.
Mr. Speaker-elect, on behalf of the whole House, may I congratulate you on your re-election. At least someone got a landslide.
Theresa May able to laugh about losing seats, but no deal in place yet that will prop her up.
As we face difficult challenges ahead, let us come together in a spirit of national unity to keep our country safe and build a stronger, fairer and more prosperous future for everyone in every part of our United Kingdom.
The Labour leader delighted in throwing the Tories' campaign barbs back at her.
Democracy is a wondrous thing and can throw up some very unexpected results. And I'm sure we all look forward to welcoming the Queen's speech just as soon as the coalition of chaos has been negotiated.
Number 10's hoped-for deal with the Northern Irish Unionists kept Downing Street waiting. Even the resident cats involved in a stealthy power play. The DUP, natural allies with the Tories, seem to be enjoying their big doorstep moment.
You ready to drive a hard bargain, Mrs. Foster?
Arriving for talks, willing in principle. Would they sign on the dotted line? But time passed, and more time passed. The DUP chose the back door to leave.
After nearly 2 hours of talks, it's the Prime Minister who's first to emerge. There's no sign of the DUP. I've been told the I's have been dotted and the T's have been crossed. but there's no sign of a final deal.
They're not exactly wearing their influence lightly. You can't blame this small party for seeming cock-a-hoop at their newly public power, even though their involvement in government is anathema to some.
If I remember vaguely, I was on the right on Saturday.
We need some more people over to the right.
I think that there's been a lot of commentary around the issues that we're talking about, and it won't surprise anyone that we're talking about matters that pertain, of course, to the nation generally, bringing stability to the UK government in and around issues around Brexit, obviously around counter-terrorism, and then doing what's right for Northern Ireland in respect of economic matters.
But relying on a Northern Irish party for a government pact is a danger, according to one former Tory PM, risking Northern Irish peace and power sharing by appearing to take one side.
I am concerned about the deal. I am wary about it. I am dubious about it. And the danger is that however much any government tries, they will not be seen to be impartial if they're locked into a parliamentary deal at Westminster with one of the Northern Ireland parties.
Concerns shared by the DUP's rivals in Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin, who took a rare trip to Parliament today.
This new arrangement is very unsettling, and people are concerned and wary of what it may mean and what promises will be given.
Tonight, Theresa May in Paris trying to get back to business. But when it's hard to keep her papers in order, let alone her party, what options does she really have?
What we're doing in relation to the talks that we're holding, the productive talks we're holding with the Democratic Unionist Party, is ensuring that it is possible to, with their support, give the stability to the UK government that I think is necessary at this time.
Yet no deal would be a risk everywhere. Theresa May has few good choices. Chin up, as this card reads, perhaps her only helpful advice. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Downing Street.
Well, Theresa May is in Paris this evening, meeting her French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron. Instead of opening discussions about Brexit with a new French president from a position of strength, a politically weakened Mrs May insisted nonetheless that Brexit talks with the European Commission will begin next week as planned. Our Europe editor, Katya Adler, reports from Paris.
It must have felt a bit lonely getting out of the car today at the Grand Élysée Palace. Emmanuel Macron's greeting was friendly, though far from effusive. The Prime Minister will have imagined this visit very differently before the election. But now she's on the Brexit back foot, her credibility damaged in Europe. Standing next to the passionately Europhile French President, Theresa May was determined to sound resolute.
I think there is a unity of purpose among people in the United Kingdom. It's a unity of purpose, having voted to leave the EU, that their government gets on with that and makes a success of it.
But President Macron had words of warning. That Britain shouldn't try to charm individual EU countries. A Brexit deal, he said, would be negotiated by the European Commission alone. But he emphasised once again the EU is reluctant to see Britain go, and in case there's a change of heart...
The door is always open. The negotiations of Brexit haven't been finalised, but the decision has been made by the people of the UK to get out of the EU. And whether French or British people, I feel one has to respect that decision.
This visit to Paris is the Prime Minister's first trip abroad since the elections, and it has been awkward because of her political difficulties at home and because of the confusion here in Europe as to what kind of Brexit the UK now wants. Despite this, though, Theresa May and the French President wanted to emphasise bilateral relations between their two countries remain strong. United in grief, the two leaders stood for a minute's silence to remember the victims of the attacks in Manchester, London and here in Paris before an England-France football friendly. Theresa May and Emmanuel Macron today announced new joint counter-terrorism plans that will remain in place, whatever Brexit brings.
In a moment we can speak to Katya Adler in Paris, but first let's go to Westminster and our political editor Laura Kunsberg. Laura, let's return to matters a little bit closer to home. No sign of a deal yet as far as the Conservatives and the DUP is concerned. Where are we with the talks tonight?
Well, as Theresa May has been watching the football with Emmanuel Macron and the Home Secretary Amber Rudd at the Stade de France tonight, negotiators on both sides have been hard at work, but I'm told the talks have just broken up for the evening. They will begin again in the morning. I have to say, although they've been unable to conclude the deal in the last 48 hours or so, there's no question that the DUP and the Tories are natural allies, and there isn't really anybody in Westminster who would say that the prospects of doing that deal are in doubt. It's very likely they'll be able to sign on the dotted line at some point tomorrow once the Prime Minister is back in the country. And the reasons for that, well, it's not just because they've been informally working behind the scenes with each other for the last couple of years, but above all else, the DUP sees an opportunity here to maximise their influence, and Theresa May absolutely needs this show of public affirmation to show to the country and to her party and to Parliament that she has the numbers across the road to be a sustainable Prime Minister, that she will actually be able to govern effectively without being buffeted at every single turn. It seems at this stage in the proceedings, while there hasn't essentially been a conclusion to these talks, the deal is not a question of if, but when.
Well, Katya, in Paris, Theresa May is there this evening. It's the first time we've heard the new French president talk about Brexit directly to a UK Prime Minister, and he struck a fairly uncompromising tone.
Well, yes. I mean, Emmanuel Macron, like other EU leaders at the moment, at this delicate political time domestically for the UK and for the EU in terms of Brexit, he did try to choose his words carefully. But yes, he had a warning, as I said there, for the UK, because the assumption in the EU is that as soon as Brexit negotiations start, the British Prime Minister and her other ministers will go on tours around Europe, trying to charm, persuade, bully or bribe individual EU countries to give the UK an advantageous Brexit deal. Forget it, said Emmanuel Macron today. EU countries have given the negotiating reins to the European Commission alone. He also underlined what I'm hearing across Europe is that despite the confusion, the arguments right now in the United Kingdom about what kind of Brexit is preferable, the EU absolutely expects it to happen. He was pushed at the press conference today, and he said, of course, the door remains open to the UK to stay right up until negotiations are finished. We heard a similar message from the EU's other great power, Germany, today from the finance minister. But again, the EU expects Brexit to happen, and until it is notified formally otherwise, it is going along with Theresa May's Brexit Plan A, the one that she formally submitted back in March, and that is that the UK would leave the European Union, which includes leaving the European single market and the customs union as well.
Katya in Paris and Laura in Westminster, thank you both very much. Inflation is rising at its fastest rate for nearly 4 years. The cost of living, as measured by the Consumer Prices Index, went up by 2.9% in the year to May. With wage increases failing to keep pace with the rise in inflation, many households are feeling the squeeze. And it gives fresh impetus to political arguments about austerity. Our economic editor, Kamal Ahmed, has more.
Whether paying for a foreign holiday, finding the money for the electricity bill, or buying your children new clothes, there was only bad news today. Rising prices, which have seen inflation increase from 0.3% this time last year to 2.9% today, the highest for 4 years. That rise in prices is biting. Martin Jackson is a nurse in Barnsley. The government has capped his pay since 2010.
Just for 1 year, we might be able to manage. But because it's been over several years and the cost of living's gone up significantly over that period, we're finding it year on year more and more difficult to manage finances on a weekly and monthly basis.
On every high street, higher prices, largely caused by the fall in the pound linked to Brexit uncertainty. Real incomes are dropping, and at the same time the government is still cutting benefits, public sector pay. Austerity is still with us.
It was Nick Timothy, Theresa May's former all-influential chief of staff, who I think made the most significant intervention on this issue at the weekend. He said the public were tired of austerity. It's a message that has cut deep with this government.
Tired indeed, and many put the surge in support for Labour last week down to that weariness, despite evidence that controlling the public finances rescued in part the economy. For supporters of a different approach, it's time for a change.
We've had 10 years of austerity, and with it, real economic failure and weakness. My hope is that finally this defunct economic theory will be put to one side, and government will have the sense to understand that the public sector needs to play a role in reviving the private sector.
Who could benefit if austerity is relaxed? Theresa May is under pressure from her new partners, the DUP, to ditch means testing of winter fuel payments. In its manifesto, the DUP said it wanted to guarantee pensions increases of at least 2.5%, backing the present triple lock. They also said they wanted to maintain benefits. Could the benefits freeze be reversed? But a warning from George Osborne's former Chief of Staff: take care on opening those spending floodgates.
Well, the deficit's much lower than it was, so if we ease up now, we'll probably be okay for a while. But at some point, if another shock hits our economy, we could find ourselves vulnerable, and we would really have repeated the mistakes of the past.
It's a hot and toxic mix. Falling real incomes, rising prices, and a government unsure of its economic direction. Expect less on balancing the books and cutting those debts, and more on higher government spending to make everyone's life a little easier. Kamal Ahmed, BBC News.
The European Union has announced plans to exert greater control over the regulation of a business worth billions of pounds to London's financial sector. The draft law calls for the European Commission to have greater oversight of financial clearing houses, which move billions of euros through the city each day. Currently, London is the undisputed market leader in the sector. It processes 3/4 of the vast trade, supporting thousands of jobs. Here's our business editor, Simon Jack.
This rather plain building is home to one of the crown jewels of the city. Companies like this act as middlemen in international trades, often between European firms in euros. And that's why this has become a front in the battle for Britain's financial services. Buyers and sellers of special financial insurance called derivatives send their orders from all over the world to clearing houses like this one behind me. And London accounts for 75% of all the trades done in euros. Now that is worth a colossal 900 billion euros a day, and accounts on some estimates for up to 83,000 direct and indirect jobs.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back.
Little wonder then, European officials have always been keen to get their hands on a piece of the action, and today launched the boldest raid yet.
We need to adjust to the fact that EU's largest financial centre will be actually leaving the EU and potentially a single market.
In the small print of today's announcement, an explicit threat to force some businesses to relocate to European centres in the interests of financial stability.
Now, one way to think about the city is like a coral reef. It's a delicate ecosystem. It's grown up over centuries, lots of specialist organisms and animals living next to each other. And it's very hard to replicate, it's very hard to build, but it doesn't mean it can't be damaged. You chip a piece of the coral off, and some of the animals, some of the plants that live next to it also suffer.
City lobbying groups insisted this intervention was not really about managing financial risk at all.
This is something for which there is no appetite amongst our members, there's no appetite amongst our customers, there's no appetite amongst European companies. Nobody, literally nobody, has come to me from an economic or commercial perspective and made the case for this. So the only driver for this is a political driver, and the important thing to recognise here is that the politics need to be conscious of the economic realities.
City veterans told the BBC that Brussels may have some power over European firms, but international firms are free to roam the world's capital markets. And if there is a mutually damaging fight between the EU and London, there is another reef out there called New York. Simon Jack, BBC News.
The European Court of Human Rights has ruled that doctors should continue to treat a terminally ill British baby until midnight on Monday to give his parents time to prepare a legal case. The parents of 10-month-old Charlie Gard, who has a rare genetic condition, want to take him to America for experimental treatment. Charlie's doctors, backed by 3 separate court judgments, insist it won't help him and argue he should be allowed to die with dignity. Inquests into the deaths of 5 of the victims of the London terror attacks have opened and been adjourned. In all, 8 people were killed and dozens injured when 3 attackers drove a van into pedestrians on London Bridge and then stabbed people in nearby Borough Market. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons reports.
They were mainly in their 20s and 30s, a period of life when a London night out on a warm summer's evening brings such pleasure. The coroner's court heard they were all murdered close to London Bridge and the popular Borough Market. Sarah Zelenak was 21, an au pair from Australia. She was found with a stab wound to her neck. Not far away was James McMullen, 32, a London entrepreneur, also stabbed. Kirsty Bowden was 28, an Australian nurse. She was found near Southwark Cathedral with a chest wound. Sébastien Bélanger was 36, French, a chef. He was stabbed in the chest in Borough Market. 39-year-old analyst Ignacio Morales de Imperial, who's Spanish, took on the killers, but was stabbed in the back near London Bridge. There would doubtless have been more victims had it not been for the heroes of that night. Dr. Johnny Moses, off duty, was at a restaurant when it happened.
I think they'd locked the doors and I said, I'm a doctor, I need to help, and they let me out. I did feel scared, but one of the things I quickly realised is that I mustn't give in to that fear.
Armed police said run. He used heart compressions to keep one man alive while he was being carried by helpers towards the bridge.
Obviously we need to try and keep that circulation going, so I was just trying to keep the chest compressions going as we were running. We had so much help from the public.
What you did was you didn't run from the area, you used your training and you probably saved lives. You're a hero. What do you think of that?
I guess I wish I could have done more.
A key task for the coroner is to examine how the victims died and not just look at the violence inflicted on them, but also wider issues, for example, the treatment they experienced on the streets that night. The police investigation has closed Borough Market, but it should reopen tomorrow. Tom Simons, BBC News.
Last week, it was the former head of the FBI. Tonight, it was the turn of America's most senior lawyer, Jeff Sessions, to testify before a Senate committee, this time to claim that any suggestion he was involved in collusion between Donald Trump's election campaign and the Russian government is what he called an appalling and detestable lie. Senators are examining claims that Russia attempted to influence the outcome of last year's presidential election. From Washington, Nick Bryant reports.
Capitol Hill, on days such as this, America's most elegantly designed theatre, the stage for the latest instalment of a Russian saga, gripping Washington and destabilising the Trump White House. Last week saw Act One, the testimony of the former FBI Director James Comey, fired by President Trump. Now the sequel, Attorney General Jeff Sessions, a former Trump campaign advisor, now the head of the Justice Department. He came out counterpunching, fierce in his denial that he'd held meetings with Russian officials last year to discuss interfering with the presidential election.
The suggestion that I participated in any collusion, that I was aware of any collusion with the Russian government to hurt this country, which I have served with honor for 35 years, or to undermine the integrity of our democratic process, is an appalling and detestable lie.
The Attorney General has recused himself from the Russian investigation, but he was adamant that shouldn't be misconstrued.
But I did not recuse myself from defending my honor against scurrilous and false allegations.
But Democratic senators complained that he refused to discuss his conversations with President Trump.
I believe the American people have had it with stonewalling.
I am not stonewalling. I am following the historic policies of the Department of Justice.
Then tempers flared.
Mr. Comey said that there were matters with respect to the recusal that were problematic and he couldn't talk about them. What are they?
Why don't you tell me? There are none, Senator Wyden. There are none. I can tell you that for absolute certainty.
So for once, the most angry words in Washington didn't come from Donald Trump. He'd left town, seemingly in a genial mood. But he can't escape the Russian cloud that hangs still over his presidency. Now, Donald Trump has made no secret of his annoyance in the past with Jeff Sessions for recusing himself from the Russian investigation, which means that his deputy has been making all the key decisions. But I dare say that Donald Trump would have been delighted with the performance of his Attorney General in the last few hours on Capitol Hill, for it was the most passionate rebuttal yet we've seen to the allegations of collusion between Team Trump and the Kremlin.
Hey, Bryant in Washington, thank you. There have been further demonstrations in the Venezuelan capital, Caracas, as the country's economic crisis deepens. An unprecedented number of people are thought to be facing hunger. The country should be one of the richest, with one of the largest oil reserves in the world. But the oil price collapse has crushed an economy already in difficulty and sent inflation soaring by over 700%. More than half of children across the country are showing signs of malnutrition. And last year, the child mortality rate rose by 30%. The international media is rarely given permission to enter the country, but the BBC's Vladimir Hernandez has been there. His report contains some images you may find distressing.
This is Anjali. She's 8 years old and weighs barely 3 stone, which is 60% of what she should. This is an oil-rich nation, now unable to feed its own people.
Hay momentos que su mamá tiene para el desayuno, otras veces no tiene, ya viene siendo como el almuerzo. Como está demasiado delgada, ¿sabes? Porque pegadito así, dice que su caja torácica no tiene la capacidad, hay momentos que le cuesta para respirar, porque no tiene carne.
This is a problem that the government is trying to keep out of sight. The media can't get into hospitals, but at this private clinic, doctors are desperate to show how bad things are. These pictures are hard to watch. They were given to me by medics in despair for treating children like these since the turn of the year. Patients are often in and out of hospital, but in a country struggling for food, chances of survival are not high.
Antes veíamos un niño con una desnutrición severa, probablemente uno al mes, pero ahora se hace inclusive hasta diario o inclusive varias veces al día. Podemos ver niños con desnutrición muy severa.
In big cities, desperate people are now chasing the bin lorry to find food.
People in this area, where there are restaurants and bakeries, say that never before they have seen so many people chasing rubbish trucks to try to get something to eat.
Usted se imaginará, uno no se siente muy bien que digamos la gente, uno lo ve feo, que ahorita no se consigue empleo, no es para conseguir la comida, es un lío y de alguna manera tengo yo que buscar la comida de mi hijo.
The lack of food is hitting mothers and children particularly hard. Outside of the capital, food is even harder to come by. Those affected are like Jermaine. At 11, he's half the average weight for his age.
Claro que me da miedo. Me da horrible. Así. Y ahorita que yo estoy desempleada, imagínate.
Since I met Jermaine, he's been rushed into hospital twice after getting help from a local NGO. But will help reach them next time? Vladimir Hernandez, BBC News, Caracas.
If you want more information about the situation in Venezuela and what's behind the crisis, you can find lots of details on our website. That's bbc.co.uk/news. More on the aftermath of the election, and this week we'll be looking at some of the factors behind the result. It was the Conservative performance in Scotland, their best for 38 years, which helped them be in a position to form a government at all. And that wasn't the whole story. Tonight, our Scotland editor Sarah Smith looks at the return of the Conservatives and Labour in Scotland.
The architecture of Scottish politics has altered yet again. Over 1/3 of seats switched hands, and the direction of travel, politically speaking, appears to have changed. One of the biggest surprises was a bit of a comeback for Scottish Labour. They won 7 seats with a 27% share of the vote, up nearly 3%. They're starting to regain some of their traditional heartlands. Winning back Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, Gordon Brown's old seat, was hugely important to Labour after the seismic shock of losing 40 of their Scottish seats 2 years ago. Now, they are still in 3rd place in Scotland, but they didn't suffer the wipeout many of them had feared.
People voted Labour in large numbers because they saw Labour as an alternative to both the Tories and the SNP. I think the really interesting thing in Scotland now is that you've got the SNP in decline, you've got Labour close to both the SNP and the Conservatives, and we're really back in the game.
One important detail. In many of the seats, like Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, that Labour won, there was actually a much bigger swing to the Tories. They took votes from the SNP and allowed for a Labour victory. The Tories took 13 seats across Scotland with a 28.6% share, up nearly 14%. But it was largely in rural areas. They're not threatening the SNP in the big cities or the central belt. They celebrated in Stirling. Their leader, Ruth Davidson, has detoxified the Tory brand enough that Conservatives now feel comfortable in Scotland.
Indie Ref 2, no more.
But they're not that far ahead of Labour by total share of the vote. They have not become the sole opposition to the SNP. The SNP had a bad night, but they did win 35 seats, over half of the Scottish constituencies, with 37% of the vote down by 13%. They enjoy support across the country in the cities and the Highlands alike. Here in North East Fife, the SNP won by just 2 votes. They scored some pretty tiny majorities elsewhere too, but in a first-past-the-post system, a win is a win, here and right across Scotland.
Of course, it's disappointing that we've lost a number of seats, but still a victory, still winning more parliamentary constituencies than all the other parties put together. And essentially, a Westminster election is not a home game for the SNP, and we won the election nonetheless.
It was inevitable the SNP would lose votes and MPs, but they fell further than anyone expected. And it feels now as though the tide has turned against their plans for another independence referendum. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Fife.
Spanish prosecutors have filed a lawsuit against the Portugal and Real Madrid football star Cristiano Ronaldo, accusing him of tax fraud worth £13 million. The case relates to non-payment of money linked to image rights. He's denied any wrongdoing. And as we heard earlier, the Prime Minister has been attending a friendly football match in Paris as part of her visit to France. The hosts managed to win 3-2 against England, despite being reduced to 10 men early in the second half. Here's our sports correspondent, Andy Swiss.
A night of sporting solidarity. As the players emerged, the managers embraced, a friendly in the friendliest spirit. But once the whistle blew, this was no cosy kickabout. England began boldly. Ryan Bertrand's cross, Harry Kane's trusty right boot, ahead after just 8 minutes. But if it seemed too good to last, it was, as their defensive frailties were exposed. Samuel Umtiti with the equaliser, and when another save from keeper Tom Heaton once again fell France's way, Djibril Sidibe gave the hosts a half-time lead. But after the break, controversy. Was that an England penalty? Well, the referee referred it to a video assistant being trialled at this game who said yes and a French red card. Harsh? Well, Harry Kane didn't mind. England level and a man up. For the two watching leaders, time for a quick Mexican wave. But it was France that ended up smiling. A late winner from Ousmane Dembele. Delight for them. England's season ends in frustration. Andy Swiss, BBC News.
Newsnight is coming up on BBC Two. Here's Evan.
Tonight, a Tory minister dropped from Theresa May's team yesterday tells us why the party has to change its ways and change its name. Join me now on BBC Two.
Here on BBC One, it's time for News Where You Are. Bye-bye.